Welcome to the next episode of the Leadership Lab. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Soumitra Dutta, Dean of Oxford University's Saïd Business School. Welcome.
Thank you, Susanna, and great to see you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We talk a lot with our scholars about leadership being a journey, not a destination. Can you tell us a little bit about where it all began for you?
Actually, you're absolutely right. Leadership is a journey. And sometimes it's very hard to pinpoint the actual start because, in many ways, it begins at home when you're young.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you're children, your parents have obviously a very strong impact on you. But for me, professionally, I would say at least the formal part of administrative academic leadership probably started when, in 1999, I was requested by the Dean of INSEAD to come and help solve a major technology problem. Essentially, the technology outsourcing company had walked out of INSEAD and had left the entire technology system completely in a bad state of dysfunction. So the whole system was falling apart, and then the dean did what I guess many leaders do, call upon someone who claimed, or at least seemed to have some knowledge of technology. I had a computer science and technology. And he told me, do you want to help us, the school? So, I had to step in to try and help the school.
I didn't realize that that's how you ended up at INSEAD.
No one joins academia to say, I'll become a dean. That's the reality, So you join academia because you like doing scholarship, you like writing papers, you like teaching students. And it's usually an accidental process that takes you into leadership. And that's actually the true story for most academic leaders. Few academic professionals would actually claim that they did a PhD, wrote the thesis, and joined an academic job just with the goal of becoming a dean.
You started your education, didn't you, in India at the Indian Institute of Technology, and then from there got your master's and your PhD at Berkeley in California, and then went on to INSEAD. After that, you went to Ithaca, New York, and were Dean of the Cornell Johnson Business School. Mm-hmm. And of course, now you're at Oxford. You've studied and taught in so many countries, so many places. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between those different places?
So I have been very fortunate, I feel, to have at least spent a large part of my career in places that attract high-quality students. INSEAD, Oxford, Cornell, they all attract some of the best young minds today around us. So just the fact of having great young minds around you is a pleasure. It's really a delight to be able to interact with great young people. Now, having said this, of course, the environment's a little bit different. So a US school tends to be very US-centric, and I think you should understand that coming from the country. And I always say that is not because America is inward-looking or America doesn't understand and appreciate the global world. I think it's simply because that's what the customer wants in America. So if you look at the American school population, typically 70% of students are American and 30% are foreign. But the interesting thing is that the foreign students also are coming to America and they want to live in America. So they actually want to learn about American business. So if you're a teacher in American school, the customer base wants a primarily American content. And that's the reason why American schools tend to be more American in the focus. Now, if you look at the global schools like INSEAD and Oxford, they're both very global. So they're very diverse, very global. And the beauty of teaching in these institutions is that there is no one dominant culture. Mm-hmm. So, in some sense, what you get is you get this diversity of viewpoints. And different minority groups, they feel more comfortable expressing their views in that kind of a global context because it's the dominant majority. So, for example, let's say you come from a smaller country, let's say like Greece. If you're sitting in the classroom in America, a student from Greece would be very reluctant to talk about this is how we do business in Greece, because in American context, business in Greece is, it's a small part of the world and small, little, not perhaps significant for the American context. But in a global context like Oxford, the way you do things in Greece might actually be very helpful to understand the way people work in Bulgaria or the way people work in Africa, perhaps, or some other countries. So I think that global perspective is, for me, the biggest difference between the different contexts.
You've talked about globalisation being sort of built into the very fibre of Oxford, and that internationalism adds purpose to an already purposeful institution. Mm-hmm. Is that what you meant by that?
So I think, the global outlook is inherent in everything that I see happening at Oxford. It's like almost any new course or any new project that is proposed or any new idea that is brought to the table, a natural question to ask is, how does it improve the world? And I think that's a very, very strong question to ask, the test by which you test different ideas. And I think it's more than just the global perspective, because, of course, you're looking at the world in a more broader sense, not just the UK, but looking at Europe, looking at Africa, looking at Asia, and so on. And part of the heritage probably comes from the British Commonwealth. But also, I think part of it comes from the feeling that we are here as a university to make the world a better place. And I think that is very fundamental, because I think that is not as explicit in many American schools, which are actually excellent from an academic perspective, because the primary goal, I would argue, in many American schools is how to make America better, how to make American sort of companies more competitive in a business school perspective, or how to make American society better. So the focus is on America first and the rest of the world later. And I think the difference that you see in Oxford is that here the rest of the world is in fact the overarching theme, and UK sort of fits inside that. And that thing I think is very important.
Yeah, that's really special. I hadn't thought of it that way around before. I mean, we do think a lot about internationalism, and as you may know, for our undergraduate scholars, well, we now partner with 19 universities. A core component of the program is 6 weeks abroad, because we think that living somewhere else away from home really uniquely opens up hearts and minds to other perspectives. For you, having lived in all these different places, what are your biggest surprises or takeaways from not being at home, I guess, and seeing how another country views a country that perhaps you're very familiar with because you've lived there?
Yeah. It's a fascinating question, actually, and my own perspective on this is, when you live in a foreign country, of course you see what the country is, how it's different, how people live there. But the most fascinating learning you have is about yourself. Because you actually start understanding, or at least questioning, why do you see the world in a certain way which does not align perhaps with the way people around you see the world. And if you're open enough to questioning that and observing that, then you start the real process of learning. Because learning happens at those moments of friction. Friction between what your view of the world might be and what you see other points of view of the world, the same situation. And the reality is that most of us, we have grown up in a certain culture, and so we become like fish in water, don't necessarily observe, or even we don't observe the air, the air is all around us. We don't observe the actual process of breathing and sort of the air around us. And so I think we don't often observe explicitly the cultural values that we bring to the table. And in a multi sort of cultural context and a more international context, that becomes much more visible. So I think the best learning you get is about yourself. Of course, you learn about the cultures, but I think that if you can learn about yourself, I think that's really where you start becoming a true leader. Because the hardest point of leadership, in my experience, is really understanding yourself. And it takes a long time. It's not easy to actually understand yourself.
We just talked about the US and how universities are different there. Of course, presidents and deans of US schools at the moment are under so much pressure from donors, from students. Does it make you thankful that you're now safely on this side of the pond?
Well, it's in a way a little unfortunate, the kind of incidents that have taken place, in America especially. But believe me, we face similar pressures. May not be to the same extent, but the pressures are here also in Oxford. So if you think of example, in recent situations of geopolitical conflict, we have received emails, we have received messages from our alumni, from multiple perspectives saying you should do this or you should not do that, or why aren't you doing this, for example, or why aren't you helping a certain group or more. And so balancing all that is not easy, it's tricky. What makes it slightly easier for us here outside the US is that the association of big donations and big money along with those perspectives are less stronger.
Yeah.
So I think what happens is it makes it easier perhaps for us to say, look, there are different perspectives. Because ultimately university, we should encourage different points of view. So that's not a bad thing to have different points of view. We should encourage it. I think what is not healthy is when one particular point of view tends to or wants to sort of drown other points of view. So I think getting students to listen to different points of view and to then make their own judgments. I don't claim that anyone is more right than the other. And you have to make your own judgment like an intelligent human being about how do you see the world.
Yeah.
And I think that ability to listen freely and to make your own judgments is something that is very valuable in the university. I think we're able to do that today, in today's context, a little bit better in Oxford and other similar non-American contexts than the US context. So I think, even though I love American universities and I've spent many years out there, and I think they're formidable academic institutions, I worry about the kind of debate that is actually being allowed, let's say, on campus. And I've heard cases... Or not allowed, exactly. I've heard cases of, situations where professors are being told what not to talk and what kind of examples you can use. And I think this is something which is permeating through a range of academic institutions in America. So I have someone I know. He happens to be the principal of a middle and high school in America, in California actually, the two in California. And he was telling me that in many grades in his school, before the teacher in biology teaches a class, he or she, the teacher, has to send the slides of the content to the parents. And the parents then decide whether the children attend the class or not. Okay, because there are views about how some aspects of biology are actually being taught in the program. So what I'm saying is that this is an interesting debate that is actually happening right now in schools and universities about what is taught, how is it taught. And I think we might be losing this perspective on allowing that development of critical thought to happen freely.
Yes, and perhaps also trust in educational institutions to know what a good curriculum, an appropriate curriculum is.
Yeah, I think this all are linked to the broader context of what is in society with social media. We all know social media, there has been a tendency to form echo chambers, tendency to actually reinforce whatever biases you have. And I think some of it is getting, seeping into academia, seeping into the behaviors of students too. So, students themselves, they suffer from the same limitations as adults. So I think the role of university should very much be to try to encourage them to search for these different viewpoints, to then actively try to integrate them with their own critical thinking, and then make whatever judgment they have to make with the situation.
Yeah. Linda Doyle, who is the provost of Trinity College Dublin and is, I think, just a phenomenal leader. She talks about it as teaching students to search for the counterfactual.
Exactly. I believe in that completely. I think we have, because somehow getting information becomes so easy, So it's too easy for us to just go to the common usual sources and then feel satisfied.
Yeah, especially when it confirms
exactly.
your own.
Exactly, especially when it confirms your own. And so I think searching requires effort.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you confront things that are different from what you might think, it's uncomfortable. So I think this notion of dealing with some discomfort is very important. And that's the same sort of parallel to what the question you asked me about what you learn when you live abroad. Because when you live abroad, you get uncomfortable to some degree. Yeah. People eat differently, people act differently, people react differently.
Even the supermarket is different.
Exactly.
The day-to-day is different.
Exactly. So the question really is, how do you get people to sort of embrace some discomfort, and learn from it?
We talked about the challenges of US universities. You've talked about the fact that Oxford in itself has challenges that are both, I think, beautiful but also complex. And one of those, I guess, is the college system, where each individual college has its own culture, its own decision-making bodies, its own P&L. Can you talk a little bit about what navigating those complexities has taught you as a leader?
So Oxford is probably, the number one ranked university in the world, yeah. But it probably also takes the number one ranking in complexity. Okay, so it's both academically number one and the complexity number one. And it's an interesting sort of, two sides of the coin. Yes, academic leadership in Oxford is complicated. Why? Because of this interesting mechanism of collegiate university where the decision-making is distributed, across the colleges, across the university. And so, unlike traditional universities, the hierarchy of decision-making is not clear. Okay, it's a little ambiguous in some sense. That ambiguity can be discomforting for some people who might want, well-defined procedures and well-defined methods. But actually, it can be also liberating. And if sometimes I think about it, and I've been at Oxford less than 2 years now, and I think about how is it and why is it that Oxford has succeeded in staying at the top for 1,000 years. It's not easy. Yeah. There are older universities in Europe, older than Oxford, but they haven't succeeded, right? So the question is, Oxford has succeeded. And I believe that one of the secrets of success in Oxford's case is this decentralized, independence that is built into the structure. So think of it like this, amorphous amoeba-like form, and the environment is changing around it in unpredictable manners, right? Yeah. And it is able to morph and adapt to the environment in a more flexible manner than probably what a more rigid structure might be able to do. Rigid structures are, of course, faster. They're also, efficient, but in a certain well-defined context. Now, if the context changes, the question is how well will the rigid structure adapt to it? And my hypothesis out here, of course I don't have proof, but hypothesis out here is that I think Oxford is better able to adapt to these different changing circumstances because the nodes, the various colleges, the various universities, the centers and so on, they're given a lot of independence to experiment. And so you can actually create things and do things more flexibly in some sense. And I think that allows the organization as a whole to be able to evolve in a much more sort of complicated manner, because life is complicated and today you need to be able to combine knowledge across different domains to be able to create solutions. And Oxford's inherent structure of having this, multiple disciplines represented at every college and students being mixed up and faculty being mixed up just helps that, it's that interesting movement of the entire university structure. I find it fascinating.
That is really interesting. And just thinking about that, I suppose Cambridge is the same. It's almost as if you've got a fleet of small boats rather than a big oil tanker. So all those little boats can be much more nimble and speedy and zip in and out of places.
It's a different structure completely.
It's a different structure, yeah.
Compared to almost any other university, either in the US or in the UK. So, it's interesting. I mean, some people find it hard to accept, hard to believe, but even the vice chancellor of the university does not control the whole university.
No.
So, that's amazing, But
I
that's
suppose
true.
it must have honed your influencing skills.
Oh, absolutely. So, in Oxford, you need a lot of social capital to operate and to successfully navigate the space. And there's a lot of relationship-based negotiation discussion that happens. And so you really have to be capable and able to work with different leaders from different disciplines in different roles, and to get people to agree on doing things and getting things to be done. And I think that requires, it really, if you look at today, people talk about doing systemic change, right? So the sort of the buzzword right now is systemic change. Whether it's food systems or anything else, you need to change the entire ecosystem. Oxford, I tell you, is a perfect training ground for that. Because it's not a question of just moving one node or one entity in the system. It's a question of moving the entire system. So you have to be good at getting the system to evolve and accept, your things. And the system, because the rules are ambiguous to a certain degree, it gives you the freedom to create. Yeah. And so you can create new things, but you have to get people around you and sort of mobilize momentum around you. And it is similar a little bit to what I hear sometimes happens in tech companies. You hear in Google, you go into Google and then people tell you don't have a job, but you go and find a good idea and find people to support you. It's similar a little bit out here. You're given the freedom to get an idea, and then you've got to get people to support you. And a lot of that is done through building social capital.
I was literally just thinking that because it's so entrepreneurial, isn't it? It's that so Google obviously now is massive, but it started as a feisty sort of startup, and that being comfortable with ambiguity, I do think is one of the hallmarks of an entrepreneurial mindset. And of course, you were an entrepreneur. You had your Fisheye Analytics, right, which you sold to the media giant WPP. Do you think that experience has influenced what you've brought into your later leadership roles?
So I love creating things. So that's something which, it's something that I like to do, partly maybe because I'm an engineer by training. So I have actually, we did create Fisheye Analytics. We sold WPP. I'm very happy about that. Right now, actually, co-founder of a venture capital firm that is focused on climate tech investing in India, primarily Green Frontier Capital. So I like doing things, both in academia and also in business. And I think what I like about it is the fact that you can have an impact. You can create and do things. So that's, I think, I like that. So for me, what has always attracted me towards this academic leadership roles is you have a chance to make change happen in the institution where you actually are working. Similarly, private enterprises, whether it's smaller startups or larger companies, I've also been on the boards of larger companies. You actually get to influence change, influence the direction of organizations. And so this notion of connection to practice is very important in my view. I enjoy it personally. I think professors in all universities should be encouraged to do more of it. I think some disciplines like business schools, we tend to do more. Engineering, we tend to do more. I think humanities, I think other disciplines should also be encouraged to do more of it. And I think that's good. To have this link between academia and practice can only help both sides. So academia becomes better because you're able to apply ideas from practice into academia and do research on the right questions. And similarly, whatever you are creating the knowledge in academia can help you to have an impact on the real world. And as I say, a lot of people ultimately want to have a positive impact on the world in some sense. So that impact cycle works faster. So I think the link between academia practice is fundamental. I try and do it in my own small way, but I encourage everyone to actually be part of the cycle. Even if you're in business, because if you're in business, I encourage business executives to spend more time in academia.
Yep.
You know, so I think it's a good cycle to encourage.
You also founded the Portulans Institute, is that how to say it, which is obviously around policy. So is that sort of a third part of that ecosystem?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. So I got into the policy side purely by accident. So it is, I didn't, you know, I'm an engineer. I ended up in a business school by accident. Ended up on the policy side also by accident.
Happy accidents.
Happy accidents, and that's another topic you can talk about, how accidents make a big difference to your life. But what happened was I was involved in the World Economic Forum, and back in 2000, you know, when the internet was just sort of new, there was a desire to actually help countries measure the impact of technology on the development in a more structured manner, as opposed to anecdotes. There were anecdotes that time of, you know, the fishermen in Malawi doing this, or the farmers in India doing this. There were stories, but they were not really measures. So I was part of a team that set up what we call the Network Readiness Index framework, which is a framework for assessing how can countries use technology development. Keep in mind, in 2000, people did not think of technology as being important for development, for the political context. Today it seems funny, but that's the reality.
Really?
In those 2000, people think looking at, you know, speeds of the internet connection, how many computers you have in a school. That was the level of analysis at that time. So we were the first, for example, in our model to talk about political environment, you know, that is so important. And today is so important, but those days, 2000, people didn't think about it. So in any case, so that got me into that model got adopted by many countries. And many countries eventually formulated a lot of the technology policies using that model as a basis. Then later in 2007, I got involved in innovation work. And I saw the innovation policies and metrics were not really the correct ones in my judgment. So I actually came up with a model called the Global Innovation Index. And that was adopted by the United Nations in 2010. So 2011 onwards, WIPO, which is the UN agency on patents and innovation, they are publishing it. I still co-edited the report. So in effect, what has happened is those two pieces of work have got me into discussions with governments about technology policies, about innovation policies. And that has been a great source of learning because it's a completely new domain for me. I didn't know about that, and I didn't study that in my PhD. So I learned about it over time. And today, actually, I enjoy, you know, so what I enjoy is, of course, working with companies, enjoy working with, you know, academic professors and colleagues, and also enjoy working with governments. And the role of governments has become so important right now. I mean, if anything, the role of governments has increased, you know, in recent years. So I think governments can have a tremendously important role in setting the right policies for innovation, technology, and so on. So I enjoy it, yeah.
Is there ever any difficulty or conflict with the fact that some of your funding or your sponsors, at least, they come from the technology side that maybe governments are looking to regulate? How do you balance those two things?
So thankfully, you know, that hasn't affected so far my work too much, because most of my work tends to be in countries that are looking to improve the technology innovation policies.
Right.
And these countries tend to be in the global south or in parts of Europe, you know, that need some more attention. And they don't have the tech companies. Okay. So the tech companies today are in largely two countries, you know, largely America and largely China.
Yeah.
Chinese government does use my research and innovation, but they don't necessarily ask for my help on policies, but they do use the data out there. So most of the help that are provided are to countries that really are looking at the global scenario of technology and innovation and wondering, I feel I'm behind, what can I do to actually catch up? I don't have the technology companies, you know, in my country. They're looking how to catch up. So that particular question hasn't affected me. I'm sure if, for example, you know, the US agencies ask for help, you know, then probably that would be directly a question of concern, because American companies, of course, are huge players in the space. But I haven't had that challenge or the quandary.
You're chair of the Global Business Schools Network, and obviously you just talked about working at the World Economic Forum. That gives you, you know, a brilliant perspective on how businesses are adapting to generative AI and all of the amazing technological advancements. Do you think on the whole people see it as an opportunity or a threat?
I don't know how people actually see it, because I think very few people actually understand what is happening.
Including companies?
Including companies, by the way. So today, if you look at the state-of-the-art large language models, LLMs, I've spoken to some of the people who are doing the stuff, the big companies, and they honestly claim they don't fully understand why the system is behaving the way it does. Okay, it's what I'm saying is that the system is showing behaviors and showing performance which they could not have predicted. And that's one reason why the world, the tech world is very excited about it, because they're seeing progress which was not predicted. And today the models become so complicated that it is in fact hard to even understand, what is actually happening inside them. So when you talk about what people feel about it, I think at this point we are, society, even trying to understand what it means for us. Yes, we know there are lots of implications, on productivity and job situations and ethical considerations and so on. But we are really in the starting phase of trying to understand what it means for us. I personally feel that the next 10 years, I'm just saying 10 years as a rough period, will be a very fruitful period where I think technology will help us in many ways. Help in improving productivity, help in providing more healthcare, health and education. So I think the next 10 years are going to be great years. The question happens, so what is interesting is what happens when technology progresses, if it does, okay, because that's the thing. Because what has happened so far is a little bit not fully understood. And one can make predictions from there and say, well, it'll keep being dramatic. Or one can say, actually, I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe we'll hit a plateau and, we'll not proceed any further. Let's assume that the progress keeps going on. Let's assume, make the assumption. If under that assumption, it is quite likely that technology will become as intelligent as human beings by some measure in sometime in the next 10 years, okay, on the next 10-year horizon. The question of what happens to life when technology becomes intelligent is the question that can be scary, and the question that we're not fully in a position to understand today or to decide on today. Why? Because let's take the picture of a modern factory. You look at a modern factory, and today a modern factory of Tesla or any other company is fully automated. You don't see anyone on the factory floor. But essentially what you have is machines, automated, becoming more and more sophisticated, and a small number of people managing the operations at some level. Now you look at today's hospital, today's hospitality hotel, today's university, and you see a lot of people, right? It's very people intensive. But if technology becomes good enough and cheap enough to replace a lot of those people, as it will become, okay, because today it's not yet cheap enough. So it's very difficult to get a humanoid robot, and humanoid robot will be too expensive and not good enough and so on. Let's assume the progress continues, and soon maybe it's possible to think of a hospital like the factory, okay, where you have humanoid robots providing the healthcare, and a very few doctors, a few people monitoring the whole system. What happens in that situation is, it's what will you do with the people? It's very interesting to ask the question. Today, I was in a session on AI organized by Oxford University in London. And one of the speakers gave the example of one of the, I will not name the company, one of the big name brand, pharma companies, using almost like, they have almost like few hundred GPTs, customized GPTs in actual use in the company right now. And what this company's CEO has said is that in the next few years, they're going to release 10, 12 drugs. And normally for those 10, 12 drugs, they would have required several tens of thousands of employees And actually what he'll do that is he'll do it with only less than 10,000. So the question really is, it's great for the company.
In terms of the drug discovery.
Yeah, exactly. So what a process that would require several tens of thousand employees, he's able now to do it only 10,000. Great savings in the company, wonderful for the profitability of the company. But what does it mean for those 80,000 people who are not being hired?
Yeah.
Now the question you can say is, well, they'll get jobs from other companies. But is that really true? If you look at, for example, even the big tech companies in India, the big ones, they have stopped or slowing the hiring of computer science engineers, okay? Because they're not completely clear for that model of software programming with technology doing more and more of it, how many of the software programmers actually need? So I think what we are not completely clear is the impact on jobs.
Yeah.
And if jobs go away, what will the reaction of people be? Because today our sense of dignity, our sense of well-being is very much linked, whether you like it or not, in the industrial age, by our ability to go to work and get a paycheck and serve food on the table for family. And I think you can extrapolate from there and see they're very important questions. I was having dinner with Sir Geoffrey Hinton recently at Oxford. He visited for giving a lecture, and I was having a discussion about these things, and he made one very important point that actually struck me. I hadn't thought of it that way. He said that let's assume that at some point machines have become as intelligent as human beings, and because they can keep on improving, they'll at some point exceed human intelligence. In nature, there is no example of a less intelligent being controlling a more intelligent being. Okay?
Yeah.
So most examples are of a more intelligent being controls a less intelligent being. So if machines become more intelligent than a human being, who will be in control?
Yeah.
And he was saying that this whole logic that put a human in the loop and the human will flick the switch off is a false premise, because if the machine is really more intelligent than a human being, the machine will convince you not to flick the switch off. So again, these are scenarios which are a little bit semi-fictional at this point, but not that far off. So the question is, what will the world look like in that stage where you'll have a lot of machines with a lot of intelligence and a lot of people with no clear jobs?
Yeah.
And how will you actually adapt to that world is a very interesting question. So I don't have the answer to that, but it's a fascinating question.
I think it really is. I mean,
Yeah.
I drive a Tesla, and when things stop working, like the sat-nav, it's always breaking down. And the service people say, have you tried rebooting it? So just in the same way as, back in the day when your PC wasn't working,
Right.
totally. Same thing with the car. And I would say that the mechanics don't really know often why it isn't working. And in fact, a mechanic said to me the other day, the problem is that we're really more like a phone manufacturer than a car manufacturer.
Absolutely.
And you wouldn't keep a phone for 6 years. Your car's a bit old.
No, absolutely.
There's built-in obsolescence,
So
right? So how does that work, though, in a hospital? You can't say, oh, sorry, our software's a bit out of date.
It's an open question about how all these things will eventually come into our life. But that's one reason why it's very important to be able to understand more precisely what the implications of the technologies will be, to experiment different scenarios, and to be able to have a flexible environment that is able to adapt to different situations.
Yeah.
The flexibility, agility, openness to experimentation becomes very critical to success in the future.
I suppose this fits a bit with one of the things that you've talked about, which is that it's really important for Oxford students to recognise that they are change makers. And so we're talking about in 10 years' time, many of your MBA students, hopefully, will be CEOs of organisations at that point. What are some of the things that you think they should be thinking of now so that they're mindful in the future of the impact of their decisions, and how are you helping to cultivate that mindfulness?
It's a very important question. And in fact, what I always tell our students is they are privileged to be able to study at Oxford. A very, very small proportion of the global population is able to have that privilege. But with that privilege comes enormous responsibility. Yeah. Because especially our students who are business students, when they go out in the world and they are in companies, every single decision they take will affect the lives of many people, sometimes thousands of people, sometimes. And I think it's important for them to look at the decisions not just as profit maximizing variables or as spreadsheet calculation, because the spreadsheet manipulations have real impact on people's lives. Whether it comes to redundancies, the children, the families, the extended family, depend on the paycheck of the employed person, gets affected. So I think it's very important to understand that their actions have broader ramifications. That's the first sort of part of responsibility, is to be able to understand that what they do has a broader set of ramifications. Yeah. Second is, of course, choosing the actions carefully such that they're able to do good. Maybe sometimes at the expense of pure profit maximization. I do believe you've got to make trade-offs. I don't think that life is such that it's simple that you can get it both. You can make lots of profit and you can also do lots of good. I think you've got to make trade-offs out here. And you've got to make trade-offs in the right way. And for me, the example that I often use is the example of the commercialization of the COVID vaccine by Oxford University. Oxford made the decision consciously that AstraZeneca would distribute the vaccine at cost in emerging markets.
Yep.
And that was a very key decision because the university knew that it would actually help to save millions of lives, which it did, because the AstraZeneca vaccine is the most widely used vaccine in the COVID pandemic. At the same time, the university knew it was giving up millions of dollars or pounds in royalties. Okay, it's a trade-off that was made.
Yeah.
Save lives and give up some money. The university did make money. We did make money, but the fact was, could have made more money if the price was higher in emerging markets. And I think that's a very good example of what I think Oxford tries to do. It's in the DNA of the school. No one in Oxford complained about that. You see, no one complained and said, you should have asked for more money and more royalties. Yeah. We would have built a bigger research lab. So it is a natural thing in the university to say, that's the right thing to do. And honestly, that impresses me. So just being new in the system too, I find that impressive that the leadership would take the decision and the people would actually support it. And I think what I hope is that we give that kind of DNA, of a mental, orientation.
Role modeling.
Yeah, role modeling to our students. Because they should do the same when they go out there in companies.
Part of the joy, I guess, of being at Oxford is that you get to meet all sorts of amazing people. You get to meet Nobel laureates and country leaders and the discoverers of vaccines. Meeting all of those incredible people, are there any similarities you see between people who really reach the peak of whatever sector they're in?
Yes and no. So, of course, everyone is different and people have achieved excellence in different ways. You meet sometimes great scientists who, are very dedicated to the research, and they're very different from, let's say, a great entrepreneur who has, successfully built companies and so on. But what I like and what I see common amongst all the different profiles is 2 or 3 things that I try to learn for myself. So one is I see a certain sense of humility in them. So even the best researcher, the best entrepreneur, they don't have that arrogance that, I know it all, I'm doing it right. So there is a sense of humility that maybe I don't know it all and I have to discover, I have to learn. So that sense of humility is very important. What I also like is the sense of courage. In almost every story that I see there's a courage in doing something somehow. Let's take the case of Geoffrey Hinton. Okay, Geoffrey Hinton, today he's seen as the guru and the father of modern AI, and people love him and worship him. But believe me, he couldn't find a job, in the winter of AI. Okay, in the winter, between early 90s and late 2009, 2010, AI wasn't frozen out. There was no funding for AI in the US. He went to Canada, he settled in Canada and got a job with Canada, actually supported him, that was very good. But what I'm saying is that he had the courage to keep on working on neural networks, building out the field, when no one else believed in it. So no one else believed in it, but he kept working at it. And a similar story happens in other examples. So people have the courage to pursue something, whatever that is. And I think the last thing that I feel is very important is not giving up easily.
Being determined.
Persistent, exactly. I think resilience, persistence is all part of the same vocabulary, but in life is never a simple straight line upwards. In life, you always have ups and downs. Everyone has ups and downs, everyone. I don't believe anyone who doesn't say they haven't had a down. So the issue is, how do you react to the ups and downs? And having this persistent resilience to keep walking, to keep, getting up when you get hurt, when you get, if you're down, to get up, brush yourself and move on. And that also is, I think, very important. So I see these 2 or 3 things that I think are common to a lot of leaders. Doesn't matter, whether they're doing pure academic research, entrepreneurship, or other kind of political leadership, yeah.
We have a tradition in these leadership labs where the last person I interview asks a question for the next person. And the questions are always so good, I sometimes end up just saying, here's the laundry list, choose. But I interviewed Lee Newman last, the Dean of IE, who you know well. And I told him it was going to be you. So he said, oh no, I have the question and you're not allowed to let him choose. So the question he had was, what is the biggest mistake that you've made and that you would want to go back and fix? And what in particular would you change about what happened the first time?
So looking back at life, I think the biggest regret that I have is not having had a second child. For different reasons, it didn't seem the right thing at that time, and I regret it. So I have a wonderful daughter, and she's giving, us a wonderful, grandchild, and hopefully second grandchild coming up soon. And I'm very happy for her that she's, aiming to have more than one. But I think I think the biggest regrets in life often are not professional, often are personal. And perhaps when I talk to other leaders, let's say, who are in important positions, or have given very important, had successful careers, almost always the biggest regrets are, I didn't spend enough time with my kids when they were growing up. I didn't pay attention to my spouse. My relationship with my family is not as strong as it could have been. So I think I would tend to, be more on the personal side. It's certainly true for me, but I think that's what I see as, from my experience with other people, when I talk to other people, as usually the thing. No one comes and says, well, I didn't make $1 million more, So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you for being so honest about that and all your answers. I would love to keep talking to you. I wish we had a chance to talk about serendipity and so many other things, but we are completely out of time. So I have just one last question, which is, what should I ask the next person who sits there?
I would ask the person who is their everyday hero. Because when we talk about heroes, we often look at big names and then I think that a lot of people who do not have those kind of big profiles and big achievements are heroes in their own way. Whether it's the single mother, whether it's whatever parent trying to raise something in difficult situations. So I think I would like to ask that question.
I will definitely do that. Thank you so much, Soumitra.
Thank you so much,
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.